This lesson is all about migration in China. Hopefully, you're all familiar with the term migration, which just means where people or a group of people move from one place to another. So, we hear in the news quite often about migration to the UK, for example, people moving from other European countries to come and live here in the UK. And sometimes people migrate the other way as well, for example, going to live in somewhere like Spain where the weather's nicer. So that type of migration is called international migration. You're moving from one country to another. However, we can also have migration which is happening within one country, and that's what today's lesson is all about. So in the UK, for example, somebody might choose to move from a rural area, that's a countryside area, where there's not many job opportunities and maybe not much going on for a young person. And they might decide to move to London or another big city where there's plenty of job opportunities, there's education, there's culture, there's fun things going on. And that would be an example of a migration which took place within one country. But somebody moving from a rural area, that means countryside, to an urban area, which is a city. And that's the type of migration that we're going to be looking at today, but obviously not in the UK. We're looking at it in China. And this is a really important type of migration that's happening in China because it's really affected the distribution of where people live in China. And it's also affected what the conditions are like in different parts of China. So just to recap, today's lesson is about rural to urban migration in China, which means people deciding to leave countryside or rural areas and go to live in urban or city areas. And in particular, we're talking about typically young people who are working age people, not older people. So in today's lesson, we're going to try and get a really good understanding of what conditions have created this movement. Why do those people want to leave the rural areas and go to the urban areas? And we're going to try and understand that process and what's driving that within China. So we're actually going to start the lesson with a story. I'm going to read the story to you. You can see there's a blurry picture of the transcript, which I'm going to read on the screen. And I've also attached a copy of it to Classroom so you can read through it yourselves afterwards. As you're listening to me tell the story, I want you to do something quite specific with it. I want you to try and recreate the story using diagrams or pictures. They can just be really basic, like stick people, on either a scrap piece of paper or in the back of your book. So basically, this is rough work. It really doesn't matter how messy it is. It doesn't matter if you miss a bit. It doesn't matter if you need to cross something out. What you're doing is you're kind of coding this information from words into diagrams, which is hopefully going to help you take this information into your mind. And after I've finished telling the story, I'm going to ask you to pause my audio and just try to retell the story yourself from your pictures. You can then check from the copy in Classroom how accurate your retelling was. And hopefully that's going to make this information kind of stick in your mind a little bit more. So I'll just give you a minute to get your piece of paper ready or turn to the back of your book so that you can do these rough sketch diagrams. Probably best to do it in a pencil, but if you've just got a pen handy, that's fine too. Remember, we're not looking for works of art. This is going to be like really basic stick people, and you're going to have to do it really quickly to keep up with the speed of the story. If you need to write any numbers or initials or whatever to remind you about something key from the picture, then you can. I'm not being too strict, but don't write down words. This should be mainly pictures. So this is a story of rural to urban migration. Zhao Yudong is 28 years old. He has a wife, a daughter aged 5, and a baby son aged 9 months. Zhao used to live in a small village in the province of Henan, 500 miles from Beijing. His village is in the mountains. Most people there are subsistence farmers, which means they live on the food that they grow. Almost everyone is very poor. Zhao's family, like others in the village, have a small plot of land that they rent. All land is controlled, like all aspects of life, by a small group of Communist Party officials. Zhao believes that many of them are corrupt and accept bribes. Some of his neighbours have lost their land because the village officials have sold it for new housing developments. Zhao's home has just 3 rooms. As well as his wife and children, his 60-year-old mother and father live with them. Water comes from an outside well, and there is no electricity. The family has enough to eat, mainly noodles, eggs, and vegetables. It's rare for them to have meat. Zhao and his wife earn very little money, typically about £40 per year. Like most families in China, Zhao and his wife were encouraged by local officials to have just one child. They were allowed to try for a second because their first was a girl. Zhao, however, knew that he would be unable to pay for a good education for 2 children if he stayed in the village. So 6 months ago, he borrowed some money and travelled 300 miles to the nearest large city. Zhao knew a man in the city who came from his village, and he stayed with him when he arrived. They lived in a single, cramped and dirty room with 3 other men who all worked on building sites in the city. On his first day, Zhao was told to join a group of men standing on the corner of a busy road junction. Each carried a heavy bamboo pole. These were bang bang men, willing to do any work that involved carrying things. The pole is laid across their shoulders, and sacks or other objects hang from the ends of the pole. The work is back-breaking, but Zhao can earn up to £40 a month, as much as he was earning a year back at home in the village. After a month, Zhao's friend got him a job on a construction site. He now earns £80 a month, but hasn't seen his baby son or wife and daughter for over 6 months. He still lives in cramped conditions and has just 2 meals a day, but manages to send money home to his family in the village. He's hoping that his children will be able to go to school and get a good education. Okay, so that is the end of the story. If you want to pause me talking now, you can check from the attached script how accurately you can retell the story. And when you've done that, if you start the audio again, I'll explain what's going to happen in the next part of the lesson. So we talked a lot at the beginning of the lesson and in the story about the idea of rural China. So rural China is really probably quite different to many of the images that you see of China, perhaps in the news or in the media. And we associate China with kind of big shiny cities and skyscrapers and kind of quite a modern looking country. But if you look at these pictures, you can see a very different side of China. We can see housing, which is pretty makeshift, tiny, poor quality. We can see people working really hard in paddy fields, doing farming, and we can see villages where the quality of life and the facilities like schools and doctors' surgeries that are available to people are really quite limited. So, rural China has what we would call in geography quite a lot of push factors. These are things which make people want to leave rural China. They are kind of bad things about life in rural China that pushes people away. So, of course, people have their families and they have their communities, but they might find that they can't earn enough money to support their family, and therefore they feel pushed, like Zhao in the story, to go and get a job in the city. People might feel that although they like living in their village, the quality of education there is not good enough. So they might feel pushed to go and live in the city in order to access better education for their children. People might find that in the village, in the rural area, they're just having to work all the hours of the day and earning no money. So they might feel the need to go and live in the city so that they can access better jobs. So the push factors are the kind of bad things about the rural areas that make people want to choose to leave these areas and go and migrate to more urban areas. If we have a look at the opposite side, these are some pictures, some really well-known pictures from urban China. So you can see here a sense of what urban China is like and what might pull people to want to live in these big cities like Shanghai and Beijing. We've talked already about the fact that jobs and pay and wages are so much better in these cities, although it doesn't work out that way for everybody in the end. You've also got much more modern housing. You've got lots more going on in terms of culture and connectivity to the rest of the world. So transport networks are much better. You can imagine, particularly as a young Chinese person, why living in the city would be much more attractive than in this remote, isolated rural area. So the pull factors are the things that draw people or pull people towards the cities and attract them to living there. Unfortunately, for many migrants, and they don't manage to get the jobs that they think they're going to get, or they end up living in quite poor conditions. So it's not always a dream come true, but still, pull factors are the things that make people want to move to the city. So all the kind of positive things about the cities, and these pictures give a little flavour of some of those advantages. So I'm going to ask you to pause my voiceover again, and you can watch this little film, which is just a minute or two. It's all about the rise of kind of big cities around the world and the process of urbanisation, which is what's caused that to happen. So, the definition of urbanisation, you might remember this from year 7, is the process where an increasing proportion of people in a country live in cities and urban areas. So, essentially, that means people are moving from rural to urban areas, like in China, and also the population's growing faster in urban areas, probably due to the fact that people are having more babies in urban areas. So in China, many people have moved from rural to urban areas, as we know. And the consequence of that is that many of these big megacities are actually found um, in China. So we've got some really big, really significant populated cities in China. And there's also a geographical pattern to where those cities are found. So what we would call the kind of urban core of China tends to be around the east coast, where it's got good transport links, good ports for ships to sail to and from, etc. And the kind of rural area tends to be in the west of the country, and we call that the peripheral area, where the economy is less successful, there's fewer people, there's less work. So that idea of core and periphery is very, very clear in China. You've got the economic core in the eastern coastal part, and you've got the rural kind of periphery in the western part of China, which is much more isolated and more inaccessible. And there's a really big difference in quality of life between people in those different regions of China. So when we had a lesson about a month or so ago, and you looked at the Dollar Street website from Gapminder, you got a sense of those differences, those inequalities that exist in China between the quality of life of like the wealthy urban people compared with the poor rural people. There's actually an index that we can use in geography to measure that if you want to be really advanced, which is called the Gini index. So some countries where inequality is very high, like China, have a really high value on the Gini index, whereas some countries where inequality is much lower would have a much lower value on that. Just to kind of illustrate that point a little bit more, this graph shows us how income in urban areas is very different in China from income in rural areas. And this graph goes all the way back to 1978, when there wasn't really that much difference between urban and rural China. But you can see by the time it gets up to 2009, it's not a super up-to-date graph, but already you can see the gap between the urban income that people have and the rural income that people have is really, really dramatic. So that tells you a little bit more about those push and pull factors. So there's a little film here for you to watch, and when you've watched it, there's a task on the slide about kind of identifying the problems in rural China. You can use your information from the Mind movie, the story at the beginning, and you can use the information from this film as well to do that task. And then the final task for today's lesson just shows you a map of what I was talking about a minute ago, this idea of core China, which is like the urbanized, richer part in the east and the poorer rural part in the west. So I want you to try and describe the location of where these large million cities and large megacities are in China. And then I want you, if you've got time, as part of the challenge, to suggest reasons for the unequal distribution of cities in China. So you might talk about rural to urban migration. Just a couple of definitions on this before I go. So a million city is a city with more than 1 million people. They're represented in grey on the map. Large cities might have between 1 million and 10 million people, so the yellow and orange ones on the map. And then the definition of a megacity, I think there's less than 50 of these altogether in the world. They are cities that have more than 10 million people. So on this map, they're represented in red. And it's quite significant that you can see at least 5 there in China, bearing in mind that there's less than 50 in the entire world. So obviously you have to look back through the slides now. All the tasks are numbered, and you can use all the information that you've kind of gathered from listening today to help you with those tasks. If you need any extra help or you've got any questions, I'll be on Google Meet, and looking forward to hearing from you. So good luck with your work. Thanks a lot, Year 8.